1. You feel language shapes how people think. Have you ever felt it? That uneasy sensation when you hear certain words repeated again and again on the news, online, in casual conversation, and you realize they are doing more than communicating information. They are shaping perception, steering emotion, narrowing the range of thought before anyone even realizes it. People who see through lies often sense this instinctively. They understand that language is not neutral. It never has been. George Orwell understood this with frightening clarity. He saw that whoever controls language controls the limits of thought itself. Words decide what can be said, what can be questioned, and eventually, what can be imagined. When language becomes corrupted, reality follows. This is not theory to you, it feels tangible. You notice how certain phrases simplify complex truths into slogans, how emotionally loaded words shut down discussion rather than invite understanding. You become aware that language does not merely describe reality, it frames it. When words are altered, softened, inflated, or weaponized, they change how people interpret events. War becomes intervention. Surveillance becomes safety. Censorship becomes protection. Slowly, the emotional response is engineered before the rational mind can engage. This awareness makes everyday communication feel different. You listen closely, not just to what is being said, but to what is being avoided. You notice euphemisms replacing honesty, ambiguity replacing accountability, repetition replacing reasoning. You sense when words are chosen not for clarity, but for obedience. Orwell warned that the destruction of language leads to the destruction of thought. If people no longer have precise words, they lose the ability to articulate dissent. Confusion becomes normal. Contradiction becomes invisible. Lies become easier to swallow because they arrive wrapped in familiar language. You may find yourself frustrated when others dismiss this concern as overthinking. It's just words, they say, but you know better. Words shape emotional boundaries. They create acceptable opinions and forbidden ones. They define who is normal and who is dangerous. Once language is controlled, force becomes unnecessary. This sensitivity often develops slowly. At first, you simply feel uncomfortable with certain narratives. Over time, patterns emerge. You notice how language shifts during crises, how fear introduces new vocabulary, how moral certainty hardens language into absolutes good versus evil, us versus them, leaving no room for nuance. You also notice how people unconsciously adopt this language. They repeat phrases without questioning their origin. They defend ideas using words they didn't choose. Their thinking becomes pre-packaged. Orwell feared this state more than outright tyranny because people begin policing themselves. To see this clearly is isolating. Conversations feel shallow. Debates feel scripted. You realize that many disagreements are not about facts, but about language frameworks that prevent mutual understanding. People argue passionately while operating inside linguistic cages they cannot see. Yet this awareness also sharpens your thinking. You become careful with words, not to manipulate, but to clarify. You resist slogans. You seek definitions. You ask what a word really means, who benefits from its use, and what alternatives are being excluded. Orwell believed that reclaiming language was an act of resistance. To speak clearly is to think clearly. To name things honestly is to weaken lies. This is not glamorous work. It doesn't trend. It doesn't rally crowds. But it preserves something essential: the ability to perceive reality without filters imposed by power. People who feel this instinctively often feel a responsibility they didn't ask for. Once you see how language shapes thought, you cannot unsee it. Silence becomes heavier. Careless speech feels dangerous. Precision becomes ethical. This is the first sign of seeing through lies, recognizing that the battle begins not with actions, but with words. 2. You are sensitive to manipulation and hidden agendas. That quiet alarm when a message feels too polished, too emotionally precise, too perfectly timed. You may not immediately know why something feels off, but your body reacts before your mind does. People who see through lies develop this sensitivity early. They sense manipulation not because they are paranoid, but because they are attentive. George Orwell understood that manipulation rarely announces itself. It hides behind reasonableness, urgency, and moral framing. It presents itself as necessity, as inevitability, as common sense. You notice when narratives are constructed to limit choice rather than expand understanding. This sensitivity makes you uncomfortable with mass persuasion. You notice when fear is used as leverage, when urgency replaces reflection, when complex issues are reduced to emotional binaries. You ask questions others avoid, not because you want conflict, but because something feels incomplete. You see how behavior is shaped indirectly. People are nudged, not forced, rewarded for compliance, shamed for skepticism. Manipulation works best when people believe they are choosing freely. Orwell warned that modern control would not rely on brutality alone, but on psychological conditioning. You begin to notice patterns. Certain messages repeat across platforms simultaneously. Certain ideas are amplified while others vanish. Dissent is reframed as danger. Doubt becomes immorality. You realize that influence is often invisible because it aligns with people's desire to belong. This awareness can feel exhausting. You cannot consume information passively. You analyze tone, framing, omission. You ask, who benefits from this message? Who is excluded? What emotion is being targeted? Fear? Guilt? Pride? Shame? Others may accuse you of cynicism, but you are not distrustful of people. You are cautious of systems. You understand that agendas do not require evil intent to be harmful. They only require power without reflection. Orwell believed that manipulation succeeds when people surrender responsibility for thought, when convenience replaces curiosity, when authority replaces reasoning. You sense this surrender happening quietly in everyday choices. You may feel tension in social spaces. Group enthusiasm feels unsettling when it discourages questions. Moral certainty alarms you when it demands obedience. You notice how easily people trade autonomy for reassurance. This sensitivity isolates you, but it also protects you. You are harder to provoke, harder to program. You resist emotional hijacking. You pause where others react. That pause is dangerous to systems built on speed and outrage. Over time, you develop discernment. Not every message is manipulation. Not every influence is malicious. But you refuse to switch off awareness for comfort. You know that freedom requires vigilance, even when it is tiring. Orwell's insight was clear. Manipulation thrives where attention is weak. To see through lies is to remain awake in a world designed to lull. And once awake, you cannot pretend not to see. Number 3. You distrust absolute authority. Power without accountability feels dangerous. Have you ever felt it? That quiet tightening in your chest when someone speaks with too much certainty, when an institution claims moral purity, when a leader insists they alone know what is best for everyone. It is not paranoia. It is not cynicism. It is an instinct sharpened by history. Orwell understood this instinct intimately. He knew that absolute authority does not announce itself as tyranny. It arrives wearing the costume of protection, order, safety, and necessity. Authority becomes dangerous the moment it stops explaining itself. When rules no longer require justification. When obedience is framed as virtue. When questioning is reframed as disloyalty. Orwell saw that power, once insulated from accountability, begins to feed on itself. It stops serving people and starts shaping them. It stops responding to reality and begins rewriting it. Those who sense this danger early are often dismissed as difficult, negative, or disruptive. You notice how power structures resist transparency. You notice how leaders avoid simple questions. You notice how systems protect themselves before protecting the individuals trapped inside them. You notice how easily people surrender responsibility in exchange for comfort. And you feel uneasy, not because you hate order, but because you understand how fragile freedom truly is. Orwell lived through propaganda, surveillance, and ideological warfare. He saw how authority manipulates fear to justify its expansion. A threat is exaggerated, repeated, and ritualized until people beg to be controlled. Safety becomes the excuse. Stability becomes the promise. And soon, obedience feels natural, necessary, even righteous. This is how people learn to love their cages. You distrust absolute authority because you understand one brutal truth. Power does not corrupt suddenly. It corrodes gradually. It begins with small compromises, temporary measures, emergency powers, just this once. And once people adjust, once they normalize the intrusion, the power never fully retreats. It only waits for the next justification. What disturbs you most is not authority itself, but how easily people accept it. How quickly they trade autonomy for certainty. How eagerly they repeat official narratives without scrutiny. You see how responsibility dissolves when authority becomes sacred. I was just following orders. That's the policy. There was no alternative. These phrases are not excuses. They are the language of moral surrender. Orwell warned that unchecked authority doesn't just control behavior, it reshapes conscience. When rules override ethics, people stop asking whether something is right and only ask whether it is allowed. At that point, cruelty becomes procedural, injustice becomes routine, and no one feels responsible anymore. You sense that accountability is the only thing standing between order and oppression. Without it, authority becomes a closed loop, answering only to itself. Laws become tools, truth becomes adjustable, and individuals become expendable. This awareness isolates you. It makes you cautious. It makes you skeptical of anyone who claims absolute moral certainty or demands unquestioning loyalty. To distrust absolute authority is not to reject structure. It is to protect humanity from its worst instincts. Orwell did not oppose power because he loved chaos. He opposed power because he understood how easily it forgets the people beneath it. Your discomfort is not rebellion, it is vigilance. And vigilance is the price of freedom. Number 4, you value truth even when it is uncomfortable. You would rather face reality than live inside comforting lies. That moment when the truth lands heavily in your mind, not as relief, but as weight. When you realize something is wrong, deeply wrong, but saying it aloud would cost you comfort, belonging, or safety. Orwell knew this moment well. He understood that truth is rarely welcomed. It disrupts narratives. It fractures illusions. It exposes contradictions people depend on to function. Most people don't fear lies. They fear truth. Lies are soft. Lies allow continuity. Lies let people move through life without friction. Truth, on the other hand, demands change, accountability, action. And Orwell saw that societies don't collapse because of lies alone. They collapse because truth becomes unbearable. You value truth not because it is pleasant, but because it is necessary. You would rather know what is real than be comforted by what is false. This choice comes at a cost. Truth isolates. It alienates. It turns you into an observer rather than a participant in collective illusions. You notice how people react defensively when confronted with facts that threaten their identity, their politics, their morality, or their sense of being good. Orwell showed how truth becomes dangerous in systems built on control. In such systems, truth is labeled subversive. Language is twisted, so lies sound reasonable and reality sounds extreme. War becomes peace. Control becomes protection. Ignorance becomes strength. And those who insist on clarity are treated as threats not because they are wrong, but because they are right. You sense how exhausting it is to constantly filter your thoughts, to measure your words, to decide when honesty is worth the backlash. You notice how truth-tellers are often punished, mocked, or quietly erased, not with violence at first, but with dismissal. You're overthinking. It's not that serious. Why are you so negative? These are not arguments. They are defenses against discomfort. Orwell understood that truth is not just about facts, it is about memory, about refusing to let reality be rewritten. When people accept false narratives, they lose their ability to judge the present. When history is altered, responsibility disappears. And when responsibility disappears, injustice repeats itself effortlessly. You feel the tension between survival and integrity. You know that telling the truth can make life harder. It can cost relationships, opportunities, safety. But you also know that living inside a lie corrodes something deeper. It erodes self-respect. It fractures identity. It creates a quiet inner conflict that no external comfort can resolve. Truth is not heroic in the movies. It is slow, uncomfortable, often lonely. Orwell never portrayed truth as triumphant. He portrayed it as fragile, constantly under attack, always requiring courage to defend. To value truth is to accept uncertainty, ambiguity, and discomfort. It means admitting when you are wrong. It means resisting narratives, even when they benefit you personally. You understand that lies don't just deceive others, they reshape the liar. The more a society repeats falsehoods, the more detached it becomes from reality. And eventually, people lose the ability to distinguish truth from fiction at all. At that point, power doesn't need to suppress truth. People do it themselves. You value truth because it is the last defense against psychological captivity. Because without it, freedom becomes meaningless. Orwell's warning was clear. Once people abandon truth for comfort, they surrender not just facts, but their capacity to think, to resist, to choose. Living with truth is harder, but it is real. And for those who see through lies, reality, however harsh, is the only place worth standing. Number 5. You notice how fear changes human behavior. Anxiety makes people obedient, silent, and compliant. That subtle shift in the air when fear enters a room. Conversations shorten. Voices lower. Jokes disappear. People who once spoke freely begin choosing their words carefully, scanning faces before expressing even the smallest doubt. Orwell understood fear, not as an emotion, but as a technology. A tool that reshapes behavior faster and more effectively than violence ever could. Fear does not need to be extreme to be effective. It does not need sirens or soldiers or prisons. Most of the time, it works best when it is quiet, when it lingers in the background, when it is vague enough that people imagine the consequences themselves. Orwell saw that fear is most powerful when it is internalized. When people begin to police their own thoughts before anyone else has to, you notice how fear makes people obedient. Not because they agree, but because disagreement feels risky. You notice how fear turns silence into a survival strategy. Speaking up becomes a calculation. Is it worth it? Will it cost me my job, my reputation, my safety, my belonging? Slowly, people stop asking questions. Not because they no longer have them, but because fear teaches them that curiosity is dangerous. Orwell observed that fear doesn't just suppress resistance, it reshapes morality. Under fear, people justify actions they would once have condemned. They accept cruelty if it promises protection. They excuse injustice if it targets someone labeled as a threat. Fear narrows empathy. It creates categories, us and them. Safe and dangerous, loyal, and suspect. And once those categories exist, conscience becomes negotiable. You see how fear spreads faster than truth. One anxious rumor outweighs 10 calm explanations. One dramatic narrative overrides 1,000 quiet facts. Orwell understood that fear makes people crave simplicity. Clear enemies, simple solutions, absolute answers. Complexity becomes unbearable. Doubt becomes intolerable. And authority steps in to provide certainty at the price of freedom. Fear changes language. People stop saying what they mean. Words become coded. Silence becomes strategic. Humor becomes cautious. Orwell warned that when fear dominates, honesty feels reckless. People begin to lie not just to others, but to themselves. They convince themselves. They believe things they merely repeat. Over time, repetition replaces conviction. What unsettles you is how normalized this becomes, how people adapt, how quickly fear becomes routine. People say, "This is just how things are now." They adjust expectations downward. They trade dignity for security. And because the change is gradual, because each step feels small, they rarely notice what they have surrendered until it is gone. Orwell's insight was ruthless. Fear doesn't need to be constant. It only needs to be possible. The possibility of punishment, exclusion, or loss is enough to shape behavior. Once people internalize that possibility, power no longer needs to intervene. People censor themselves. They conform automatically. They become predictable. You notice how fear makes people suspicious of one another. Trust erodes. Conversations become performances. Everyone is careful not to stand out, not to be misunderstood, not to be seen as a problem. Fear isolates individuals while creating the illusion of unity. Everyone appears aligned, but beneath the surface, everyone is alone. This awareness is exhausting. You cannot unsee it. You recognize fear's fingerprints everywhere. In the news, in policies, in conversations, in silence. You understand that fear is not just an emotional reaction. It is a method of control. And once you see that, compliance no longer looks innocent. It looks conditioned. Orwell's warning was not that fear would arrive suddenly. It was that people would adapt to it so thoroughly they would forget what courage felt like. To notice fear's effects is to resist them, quietly, internally, by refusing to let anxiety rewrite your values. By remembering that obedience born of fear is not virtue, it is surrender. Number 6. You feel disturbed by groupthink. When everyone agrees too easily, you become suspicious. Have you ever felt it? That uneasy sensation when everyone around you nods in perfect unison, when opinions align too smoothly, when disagreement disappears, not because issues are resolved, but because questioning feels unwelcome. Orwell understood that unanimous agreement is rarely a sign of truth. More often, it is a sign of pressure. Groupthink is comforting. It removes responsibility. It dissolves doubt. It tells you that if everyone believes something, it must be right. Orwell saw this as one of the most dangerous illusions in human psychology. The crowd feels safe precisely because it diffuses accountability. No one feels responsible for the consequences of collective belief. You become suspicious when consensus forms too quickly, when complex issues are reduced to slogans, when moral certainty replaces inquiry. Orwell knew that groupthink thrives in environments where fear and conformity coexist. People don't agree because they are convinced. They agree because disagreement feels risky, exhausting, or isolating. What disturbs you is not that people think differently, but that they stop thinking altogether. Groupthink discourages nuance. It punishes hesitation. It frames questions as weakness and skepticism as hostility. Orwell observed that once a group decides what is acceptable, truth becomes secondary to belonging. You notice how language changes under groupthink. Certain phrases become mandatory. Certain opinions become untouchable. Certain questions become forbidden. It's not by law, but by social consequence. People begin speaking in rehearsed patterns. Conversations lose depth. Thought becomes performative. Orwell showed how groupthink is reinforced by repetition. The same ideas circulate until they feel inevitable. Familiarity replaces evidence. Agreement replaces understanding. Over time, people confuse consensus with reality. They stop asking whether something is true and start asking whether it is popular. Groupthink is seductive because it relieves anxiety. Doubt is uncomfortable. Ambiguity is exhausting. The group offers certainty, identity, moral clarity, but the price is individuality. Once people outsource thinking to the collective, they surrender the most dangerous freedom of all, the freedom to be wrong independently. You feel the tension between speaking and silence. You know that questioning the group can lead to ridicule, exclusion, or suspicion. Orwell understood that social punishment is often more effective than force. People will endure private discomfort to avoid public isolation, and so they comply. They nod, they repeat, they pretend. What alarms you is how quickly groupthink escalates. Once dissent disappears, extremes become possible. Without opposition, ideas harden, policies intensify, moral lines blur. The group, convinced of its righteousness, becomes capable of cruelty without guilt. Orwell saw this repeatedly in ideological movements that began with noble intentions and ended in repression. You also notice how groupthink rewrites memory. People forget past contradictions. They reinterpret events to fit current narratives. Yesterday's truth becomes today's heresy. Orwell warned that when a group controls meaning, reality becomes unstable. History becomes flexible, and individuals lose their anchor. To resist groupthink is lonely. It requires standing apart without certainty of being right. It requires tolerating discomfort. It requires thinking slowly in a world that rewards instant alignment. Orwell did not romanticize this resistance. He portrayed it as quiet, fragile, and often invisible. You don't reject consensus automatically. You reject unexamined consensus. You believe agreement should be earned through inquiry, not enforced through pressure. Orwell's lesson was clear. When everyone agrees too easily, something essential has been lost. Usually truth, sometimes humanity. Seeing through groupthink does not make you superior. It makes you responsible. Responsible for your own thoughts, your own doubts, your own moral compass. And in a world that prefers alignment over integrity, that responsibility is both burden and freedom. Number 7. You believe freedom begins in the mind. Control starts when people stop thinking for themselves. Have you ever felt it? That quiet realization that the most important battles are never fought in public, never announced, never televised. They take place silently inside the human mind. Orwell understood this with terrifying clarity. Long before chains appear on bodies, chains are placed on thoughts. And once the mind is captured, the rest follows effortlessly. True control does not require constant force. It requires compliance. And compliance begins the moment people stop thinking for themselves. Orwell saw that freedom is not primarily political or physical, it is psychological. You can live in a society that calls itself free and still be profoundly imprisoned if your thoughts are no longer your own. You notice that the most effective systems of control do not forbid thought outright. They flood it. They overwhelm people with noise, distraction, outrage, urgency. Thinking becomes exhausting. Reflection feels indulgent. Silence feels suspicious. People are kept busy reacting, never contemplating. Orwell warned that a population constantly stimulated is easier to manage than one that is oppressed. Freedom of the mind requires slowness. It requires doubt. It requires the uncomfortable act of questioning what feels obvious. Orwell knew that when people abandon this effort, they begin outsourcing thought to authority. to institutions, to experts, to majorities, to trends. And once that outsourcing becomes habitual, thinking feels unnecessary, even dangerous. You see how control advances subtly, not through censorship alone, but through convenience. People are given ready-made opinions, prefabricated conclusions, emotional shortcuts. Why struggle to understand when someone else will explain what to feel? Orwell recognized that intellectual laziness is one of tyranny's most reliable allies. When people stop thinking, language decays. Words lose precision, meaning blurs. Contradictions coexist without tension. Orwell's concept of doublethink was not fantasy, it was diagnosis. The ability to hold two opposing ideas without discomfort is not intelligence, it is surrender. It signals that the mind has stopped demanding coherence. You understand that freedom of thought is not about having opinions, it is about examining them. It is about tracing where they came from, who benefits from them, what they obscure. Orwell believed that the moment a person accepts ideas without interrogation, they have already yielded control. This is why independent thinking is treated with suspicion. Questioners disrupt predictability. They introduce uncertainty. They slow down consensus. And systems built on efficiency and control cannot tolerate friction. Orwell saw how thinkers are reframed as troublemakers, cynics, or threats, not because they are wrong, but because they are uncontrollable. You also recognize the cost of mental freedom. It is isolating. It strips away comforting illusions. It forces you to live without guarantees. Orwell never suggested that thinking freely would make you happy. He suggested it would make you honest. And honesty, in a managed world, is dangerous. Freedom begins the moment you refuse to repeat what you have not examined. The moment you hesitate before agreeing. The moment you notice your own discomfort and refuse to silence it. Orwell understood that the mind is the final frontier of power. Once it falls, everything else follows quietly. Number 8. You pay attention to small changes in society. You know major shifts begin quietly, not suddenly. That subtle sense that something has shifted, even though no one is talking about it. No announcement, no crisis. Just a quiet change in tone, in language, in expectations. Orwell knew that the most dangerous transformations never arrive dramatically. They arrive gradually, disguised as normal. You notice small things. A word that used to be acceptable suddenly isn't. A question that once sparked discussion now causes discomfort. A behavior that once felt optional now feels mandatory. Orwell understood that these minor adjustments are how societies recalibrate what is acceptable, what is thinkable, what is possible. Major changes do not begin with laws. They begin with habits, with assumptions, with what people stop questioning. Orwell warned that when people ignore small shifts, they surrender their ability to respond when those shifts accumulate into something irreversible. You observe how language evolves, not naturally, but strategically. Words are softened, meanings are blurred. Euphemisms replace clarity. Orwell believed that when language becomes vague, power becomes invisible. People cannot resist what they cannot name. You pay attention to who is allowed to speak freely and who must speak carefully, to which opinions require disclaimers, to which narratives are amplified and which quietly disappear. Orwell knew that suppression does not always look like force. Sometimes it looks like omission. What alarms you is how quickly people adapt, how yesterday's abnormal becomes today's routine. Orwell called this the normalization of control. Each small concession feels insignificant. Each adjustment feels temporary. But together, they reshape reality. You notice how surveillance begins as safety, how monitoring begins as convenience, how restrictions begin as protection. Orwell understood that intentions matter less than outcomes. Systems expand, powers consolidate, and once granted, Authority is rarely returned voluntarily. You also see how resistance becomes harder the longer change goes unnoticed. When shifts are gradual, there is no clear moment to object. No obvious line crossed. People look back and realize something essential is gone, but cannot identify when it disappeared. Orwell's insight was devastating. Societies do not collapse into tyranny. They slide. Quietly, comfortably, reasonably. And by the time people notice, the mechanisms are already in place. You pay attention because attention is defense. Awareness is friction. To notice small changes is to slow them down, to question them, to refuse automatic acceptance. Orwell believed that vigilance is not paranoia, it is responsibility. This sensitivity isolates you. Others tell you you're overthinking, that you're exaggerating, that things are fine. Orwell knew this response well. The early observer is always dismissed, until it's too late. Seeing small changes is not about predicting disaster. It is about preserving agency. It is about refusing to sleepwalk through history. Orwell's work was a warning written in advance, not an obituary written afterward. Number 9. You feel isolated for seeing things clearly. Awareness separates you from the crowd. Have you ever felt it? That quiet, aching distance between you and the people around you. Not because you dislike them, not because you feel superior, but because you see something they either cannot see or refuse to see. Orwell understood this isolation deeply. To see clearly in a world built on distortion is to become lonely by default. Awareness is not socially rewarded. It disrupts comfort. It challenges shared illusions. Most people do not bond over truth. They bond over agreement. Orwell saw that society functions not on accuracy, but on cohesion. And cohesion demands compromise often at the expense of reality. When you begin to notice contradictions, manipulations, and subtle shifts in power, you also begin to notice how invested others are in not noticing them. Their identities, relationships, and sense of safety are often tied to the very narratives you question. To point out the cracks feels, to them, like an attack. This is why clarity creates distance. You hesitate before speaking. You soften your words. You remain silent when something feels wrong, not because you lack courage, but because you understand the cost. Orwell knew that truth is not rejected because it is false, but because it is destabilizing. The loneliness deepens when you realize that many people sense something is wrong, but choose comfort over confrontation. They feel the unease, but bury it beneath routine, entertainment, and repetition. Orwell recognized this as a form of self-preservation. Ignorance becomes shelter. You are not isolated because you lack empathy. You are isolated because you have too much of it. You see how fear shapes behavior, how power exploits uncertainty, how language dulls resistance, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Orwell never portrayed the truth seeker as heroic in a glamorous sense. There is no applause, no mass awakening, just quiet endurance. To see clearly is to live without the anesthesia of collective delusion. The crowd offers belonging, but at a price. It demands silence. It demands repetition. It demands that you suspend your doubt. Orwell understood that most people would rather feel included than be accurate. And so, the one who refuses to lie, especially to themselves, stands apart. This isolation is not a flaw. It is a signal. It tells you that your perception is still intact, that your thinking has not been fully absorbed. Orwell believed that solitude is often the last refuge of mental freedom. To live with awareness is to accept distance, but it is also to retain dignity. You may walk alone, but you walk awake. And in a world drifting toward comfortable sleep, that alone is an act of quiet resistance. Number 10. You believe truth is a personal responsibility. Silence feels like complicity. That weight in your chest when you choose not to speak. That subtle guilt when you notice a lie being repeated and let it pass unchallenged. Orwell understood this tension intimately. Truth to him was never abstract. It was moral. And it was personal. In oppressive systems, lies do not survive because everyone believes them. They survive because enough people remain silent. Orwell saw that tyranny does not require universal belief, only widespread compliance. Silence becomes the lubricant of control. You understand that truth is not something institutions protect. It is something individuals carry. And when individuals abandon that responsibility, truth erodes quietly. Not all at once, but gradually, through omission, euphemism, and fatigue. Speaking the truth is rarely dramatic. It does not always look like protest or rebellion. Often, it is simply refusing to repeat what you know is false, refusing to use distorted language, refusing to pretend confusion when clarity exists. Orwell believed that every time you distort your words to avoid discomfort, you weaken your mind. Language shapes thought, and when language becomes compromised, thinking follows. This is how people begin to accept what they would once have rejected. You also know that truth is costly. It invites conflict. It risks exclusion. It complicates life. Orwell never denied this. He insisted on it. Truth is not virtuous because it is easy. It is virtuous because it demands sacrifice. There is no neutral position. Silence is not passive. It reinforces whatever is already dominant. Orwell warned that neutrality in the face of manipulation is alignment with it, not because you agree, but because you allow it to proceed unchallenged. This responsibility is exhausting. You cannot correct everything. You cannot expose every lie. Orwell did not expect heroism. He expected integrity. To guard your own thinking, to speak when it matters, to resist internal corruption before external oppression. Truth begins privately, in the refusal to lie to yourself, in the discipline of naming things accurately, in the courage to endure discomfort without escaping into denial. Orwell believed that once this inner honesty is lost, no external freedom can compensate. To hold truth as a responsibility is to live with tension, but it is also to live with self-respect. You may not change the world, but you refuse to be reshaped by it. And that, Orwell believed, is the beginning of all real resistance. And so we arrive at the end, not with comfort, but with clarity. Orwell never promised peace of mind. He offered something far more difficult and far more necessary: awareness. To see through lies is not to escape suffering. It is to understand it. It is to recognize how language molds thought, how fear disciplines behavior, how power prefers obedience over truth, and how the mind is the first and final battleground. This understanding comes at a cost: isolation, doubt, discomfort, but it also preserves something essential: integrity, the quiet knowledge that your thoughts are still your own. Orwell's psychology is not pessimism, it is vigilance. It is the recognition that freedom does not vanish overnight. It erodes through small concessions, softened words, and unchallenged narratives. And once gone, it is rarely reclaimed without pain. To lie awake is to resist sleepwalking through history. It is to notice, to question, to hesitate when certainty is demanded, to value clarity over comfort, to accept solitude over false belonging. The world does not need more noise. It needs more people willing to think slowly, speak carefully, and refuse to lie, especially to themselves. Freedom, Orwell reminds us, does not begin with revolution. It begins in the mind, and it survives only as long as individuals are willing to protect it. The question is not whether the world is honest. It rarely is. The question is whether you will be.